The woman, standing in the doorway, was his wife. Same silver hair pulled back in the loose bun she always wore. Same navy cardigan with the missing button on the left cuff. Same faint scar above her right eyebrow from a childhood accident she'd told him about 40 years ago. But when Robert reached out to touch her shoulder, she flinched away from him like he was a stranger trying to grab her on a crowded street. "Margaret," he said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable. She stared at him with eyes that held no recognition. Her lips parted, and sounds came out. They weren't words, they were fluid and musical, rising and falling in patterns that felt almost familiar. The way a dream feels familiar even though you've never experienced it before. The syllables rolled over each other, soft consonants and elongated vowels that belonged to no language Robert had ever heard in his 60 years of life. She spoke for nearly a minute, her hands moving in small, precise gestures, before she stopped and waited, watching him with the polite attention of someone who has just asked directions from a foreigner. Robert's knees went weak. He gripped the door frame. It had been 3 days since she'd left for her walk. 3 days before, on a Tuesday morning that had tasted of rain and coffee, Margaret had kissed him on the cheek and told him she was going to walk down to the seawall. She did this every Tuesday and Thursday morning, had done it for the 12 years since they'd retired and moved to Vancouver from Ontario. She liked to watch the cargo ships in the harbor and feed the ducks near the marina. She always took the same route. Down Burrard Street, left on Pacific, then along the water until she reached a little bench near the aquarium where she'd sit and read whatever mystery novel she'd picked up from the library the week before. Robert had been making toast when she left. He remembered the smell of burning butter because he'd been distracted, trying to find the sports section of the newspaper. When the smoke alarm went off, he'd cursed, waved a dish towel under the sensor, and forgotten entirely about her kiss still warm on his cheek. She should have been home by 11. By noon, he'd called her cell phone 6 times. By 2 in the afternoon, he was in the car, driving her route, scanning the sidewalks and parks. He'd filed a missing person report at 4. The police had been kind, but not particularly concerned. She was an adult. No signs of foul play. People sometimes needed space. Give it 24 hours. But Robert knew. He knew the way you know when you've left the stove on even though you can't remember checking. He knew the way you know someone is standing behind you in a dark room, even before you hear them breathe. Margaret wouldn't have left without telling him. Not after 42 years of marriage. Not when her pills were still in the bathroom cabinet and her reading glasses were folded on the nightstand. He'd spent 3 days becoming intimate with fear. He learned that fear tastes like metal and sits in your stomach like a stone. He learned that you can exist in a state of pure, crystalline panic for 72 hours straight without your heart actually exploding, even though it feels like it should. He'd driven the route 17 times. He'd called her sister in Toronto. He'd contacted the hospitals, the shelters, the morgue. He'd posted her picture on Facebook, even though he barely knew how to use it, and their daughter Emma had to walk him through it over the phone from her home in Seattle. And then, on Friday evening, just as the sun was setting over the North Shore Mountains and painting the sky the color of a bruise, she came home. She walked up the front steps of their small house on West 15th Avenue the same way she always did, one hand trailing along the black iron railing. She was wearing the same clothes, the green walking shoes he'd bought her last Christmas. the waterproof jacket because it had been drizzling that Tuesday morning. Her purse was still over her shoulder, but she wasn't Margaret. Not the Margaret who had left. Robert stood in the doorway now, watching this woman who wore his wife's face and felt reality tilt sideways. She was looking past him into the house with mild curiosity, the way you might look into a shop window at a display that doesn't quite interest you. No fear, no relief, no emotion at all. "Where were you?" he asked, though his throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. "Margaret, where have you been?" Everyone's been looking for you." She spoke again in that liquid, impossible language. This time her tone was gentler, almost apologetic. She gestured toward the interior of the house, then at herself, then made a questioning motion with her hands. Robert stepped back without thinking, and she walked inside. She moved through the living room like a tourist in a museum, pausing to examine the framed photos on the mantel. The Afghan draped over the couch that her mother had crocheted 30 years ago. The stack of crossword puzzle books on the coffee table. She picked up their wedding photo, the one where they were impossibly young, and squinting into the prairie sun outside the church in Regina. She studied it for a long moment, her head tilted slightly to one side. Then she set it down carefully and moved on. "Margaret." Robert followed her, his voice rising. "Margaret, please, it's me, it's Robert. We've been married for 42 years. We have 2 daughters, Emma and Claire. You love mystery novels and you hate cilantro and you have a birthmark shaped like a comma on your left hip. Please." She turned to look at him then, and for just a second something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, confusion, pain. But it was gone before he could name it, replaced again by that polite, distant curiosity. She walked into the kitchen. Robert watched her open the refrigerator, study its contents with the same careful attention she'd given the living room. She pulled out a yogurt, examined the label, put it back. She tried the tap at the sink, let the water run over her fingers, then shut it off. Every movement was deliberate, exploratory, like she was learning the space for the first time. "I'm calling Emma," Robert said, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling someone." "But who did you call when your wife came home but wasn't your wife anymore? When she looked at you like you were a kind stranger who'd let her into his house?" He called Emma anyway. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, is there news?" "She's here," Robert said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, high and thin. "She came home. But Emma, something's wrong. Something's very wrong." "What do you mean she's home? Is she hurt? Let me talk to her." Robert held out the phone toward Margaret. She looked at it, then at him, then said something in that flowing, impossible language. On the other end of the line, Emma's voice went sharp with panic. "Dad! Dad, what was that? What's going on?" "She doesn't remember me," Robert said quietly. "She doesn't speak English. She doesn't speak anything. Emma, I don't know what to do." Emma was on the next flight out of Seattle. The hours until she arrived were the longest of Robert's life. Margaret, because what else could he call her, wandered the house, touching things with careful fingers, occasionally speaking in that strange tongue as if she expected him to understand. She seemed neither distressed nor comfortable, just endlessly, distantly curious. And when she got tired, she lay down on the couch, not the bed they'd shared for decades, and fell asleep almost instantly. Robert sat in the armchair across from her and watched the rise and fall of her breathing. In sleep, she looked exactly like the woman he'd woken up next to for 15,000 mornings. The same slight frown between her eyebrows. The same way her left hand curled under her chin. He must have fallen asleep himself because the next thing he knew, Emma was shaking his shoulder and dawn light was creeping through the curtains. His daughter looked exhausted, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes red-rimmed. "Where is she?" Emma whispered. Robert pointed to the couch. Emma crossed the room slowly, like she was approaching a wild animal. She knelt beside her mother and reached out to touch her shoulder. Margaret's eyes opened. She sat up, looked at Emma, and smiled. It was a polite smile, friendly but impersonal, the smile you give a barista who hands you your coffee. She spoke again in that liquid language, a rising inflection at the end like a question. Emma's face crumpled. Mom, it's me. It's Emma, your daughter. What happened to you?" But Margaret just kept smiling that terrible, empty smile. They took her to the hospital. The doctors ran tests, asked questions, shone lights in her eyes, and checked her reflexes. Physically, she was fine. Perfect, even. No signs of trauma, no evidence of drugs in her system, no indication she'd been harmed. Her blood pressure was better than it had been at her last checkup. The MRI showed nothing unusual. The neurologist, a tired-looking woman with gray streaks in her black hair, pulled Robert and Emma aside. "I've never seen anything quite like this," she admitted. "The language she's speaking doesn't match any known linguistic patterns. We brought in a linguist colleague, and even he's baffled. It's consistent, though. She's not just making random sounds. There's grammar, structure. It's a real language. It's just not one that exists." "What about her memory?" Emma asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Can you fix it?" "We're running more tests, but I have to be honest with you. I don't know what we're dealing with here. Amnesia, yes, but the language component. That's not typical of any amnesia presentation I've encountered. Usually, if someone forgets their identity, they still retain language. They might forget their name, their family, their past, but they don't forget how to speak English if that's their native tongue." Robert felt something crack inside his chest. "So, what are you saying?" The neurologist hesitated. "I'm saying we need to keep her for observation. I'm saying this is beyond my area of expertise. I'm saying I don't have answers." They kept her overnight. Robert and Emma stayed in the waiting room, drinking terrible coffee from paper cups and not talking about what they were both thinking. When they were finally allowed back into Margaret's room, they found her sitting up in bed, watching the morning news on the television with that same distant interest she'd shown everything else. That's when Robert saw it. A hospital bracelet on her right wrist. He'd assumed the nurses had put it on when they admitted her. But when he leaned closer, squinting in the fluorescent light, he felt the floor drop out from under him. The date printed on the bracelet was clear and crisp. April 7th, 2029, 3 years in the future. Robert's vision blurred. He gripped the bedrail. "Emma," he said, and his voice came from somewhere far away. "Emma, look at this." His daughter leaned over, read the date, went very still. "That's not possible," she whispered. "That's a mistake. It has to be a mistake." But the bracelet looked old. The edges were slightly frayed, the plastic yellowed as if from age. And there were other details, small things Robert noticed now with growing horror. The style of the bracelet was different from the ones he'd seen on the other patients. more advanced. The barcode was longer, more complex, and the hospital name printed on it wasn't Vancouver General Hospital. It said Vancouver Neurological Institute, a place that, as far as Robert knew, didn't exist. Emma was talking to nurses, demanding explanations, her voice getting louder and higher. But Robert just stood there, staring at the woman who looked like his wife, trying to understand. She met his eyes. For a long moment they looked at each other across a distance that felt like years, like centuries, like the space between stars. And then she spoke. One word, in English. Her first word in English since she'd come home. She said, "Sorry." Her voice was Margaret's voice. The tone, the slight rasp from years of smoking in her 20s, the way she softened the R. It was her. It was absolutely her. And then she switched back to that impossible language, and the moment was gone. Robert never got a real answer. The doctors couldn't explain the bracelet. They suggested it was a prop. Maybe Margaret had been confused, wandering, found it somewhere. But they couldn't explain where. They couldn't explain the language. They couldn't explain why a woman with no history of mental illness had suddenly, completely forgotten her entire life. After a week, they released her into Robert's care with a list of medications and appointments, and a social worker who checked in twice a week. Margaret, because he still called her Margaret, would always call her Margaret, lived with him, but was not with him. She learned to navigate the house, learned where the bathroom was, where the kitchen was. She ate when food was put in front of her. She slept on the couch. She watched him with those curious, empty eyes. Sometimes, late at night, Robert would sit beside her and talk. He'd tell her about how they met at a church dance in Regina, how she'd stepped on his foot and laughed, how they'd danced until the lights came on. He'd tell her about Emma's first steps, Claire's graduation, the trip they took to Italy for their 30th anniversary. He'd tell her about the life they'd built together, the life that existed now only in his memory. She'd listen. She'd smile sometimes. Once, she reached out and patted his hand, a gesture of comfort that felt practiced, borrowed from whoever she was now. Emma came to visit every weekend. Claire flew in from Montreal. They all tried to reach her, to pull her back. But the woman on the couch remained a visitor in Margaret's body, polite and pleasant and utterly, completely gone. Robert kept the hospital bracelet. He locked it in a drawer in his study, along with the police reports and the medical files and all the documentation of those 3 missing days. Sometimes he'd take it out and stare at the date. April 7th, 2029. He tried not to think about what it meant, about where she'd been, about what might happen in 3 years when that date finally arrived, about whether the woman he loved was still somewhere in there, trapped behind eyes that no longer recognized him, or whether she was somewhere else entirely, 3 years ahead, waiting in a place he couldn't follow. At night, when the house was quiet and Margaret was asleep on the couch, Robert would stand at the window and look out at the dark street. He'd think about that Tuesday morning, the smell of burning toast, the kiss on his cheek. The last normal moment before the world tilted sideways and never quite righted itself again. She never came home. Not really. Someone else came home in her place, wearing her face, walking in her shoes, living in her house. And Robert learned to live with that, the way you learn to live with any wound that never quite heals. He learned that love doesn't end when the person you love disappears. It just changes shape, becomes something harder and sadder and infinitely more patient. Every day, he waited for a sign, for an answer, for April 7th, 2029, for Margaret to come home.
The scripted casebook remains open. Subscribe to the archive. Share the evidence. Leave your verdict below. Some secrets are better shared.